Madeline Harper always prided herself on keeping her life in perfect order. Her mornings began with the precision of clockwork, a steaming cup of coffee, a meticulously folded outfit laid out for work, and a glance at her calendar, which was color-coded and immaculate. Gavin, her husband of 7 years, usually lingered over breakfast, occasionally teasing her about her obsession with schedules. But Madeline found comfort in the predictability. At least, she had thought it was comfort. The Harper home, a spacious townhouse on the outskirts of the city, looked flawless to anyone visiting. Polished hardwood floors, framed family photos lining the staircase, and the scent of fresh lilies drifting from the vase on the dining table. Yet beneath the surface of domestic perfection, cracks had begun to form, so subtle that Madeline had almost ignored them at first. Small things, Gavin forgetting dinner plans, brushing off her questions about his day with a distracted smile, or suddenly taking business calls late into the night. She chalked it up to stress, convincing herself she was being paranoid that it wasn't until a Thursday evening that the illusion shattered completely. Maddie had returned home earlier than expected from work, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder, heels clicking against the marble tiles. She had hoped to surprise Gavin with tickets to a concert he had mentioned months ago. Instead, she walked into a scene that made her chest tighten. His phone lying on the kitchen counter, buzzing insistently. A single notification from a contact she didn't recognize. "Can't wait to see you tonight," face blowing a kista. Her fingers trembled as she hesitated, hovering over the device. A part of her wanted to ignore it, to cling to the normalcy she had built. Another part, sharper and angrier, demanded the truth. She swiped to read the message thread, and what she found left her reeling. Flirtatious texts, suggestive photos, and casual jokes exchanged at times that coincided perfectly with his late meetings. The casual cruelty of it, his ease in hiding the affair, made the betrayal sting even more. Madeline stepped back, letting the phone fall onto the counter. She felt a whirlwind of emotions: shock, disbelief, humiliation, and beneath it all, a burning anger that she had never known in herself before. Her mind raced. Questions tumbled over one another. How long? How could he? Did he even love her? Or had she been living with a stranger all these years? She retreated to the bedroom, needing to think, to breathe. The room was empty and silent, save for the faint hum of the city outside. Maddie sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the framed wedding photo on her nightstand. In it, she and Gavin smiled at each other, blissful and young. The smile on her face in the photograph seemed like a cruel lie now. Hours passed as she replayed moments in her head, searching for signs she had missed. There were so many little inconsistencies she had brushed aside. The extra perfume scent, the sudden interest in business trips, the way he always seemed distracted during conversations. The more she thought, the more evidence accumulated in her mind. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This was deliberate, ongoing, and calculated. When Gavin finally walked in, casually tossing his jacket onto the chair, Maddie felt a cold detachment settle over her. He smiled, oblivious to the storm raging behind her eyes. "Hey, you're home early," he said, as though nothing had changed. She didn't respond immediately, letting the silence stretch. He frowned slightly, sensing tension but unable to pinpoint its source. "Maddie, what's wrong?" Her voice, when it came, was steady but laced with quiet fury. "I saw the messages, Gavin." Gavin froze, the color draining from his face. For a moment, Maddie thought he might lie, deny everything. But he didn't. Instead, he shifted uncomfortably, muttering something about "it's complicated," a feeble attempt to downplay the betrayal. Maddie's anger surged. She left the room without another word, retreating to the study. Her mind churned with ideas, each one sharper than the last. She couldn't undo what had happened, but she didn't need to. She realized she had a choice: to crumble under the weight of humiliation or to rise above it, to make sure Gavin never underestimated her again. That night, she sat at her desk, staring at a blank notebook. Maddie's hands shook slightly as she wrote. Not random thoughts, but a plan. Not yet for confrontation. This was too delicate for emotion-driven action, but a strategy. Every move had to be calculated, every step precise. She would regain control, not only of her life, but of the imbalance that Gavin's betrayal had created. Despite the pain, she felt a flicker of something unexpected: empowerment. The betrayal had awakened something in her, a resolve she hadn't realized she possessed. She would not be the woman who waited silently, broken and humiliated. No, she would chart her own path, and Gavin would come to regret every careless decision that had led him to this point. A.S. Maddie closed her notebook and switched off the lamp. She allowed herself a quiet, determined smile. Tomorrow, she would begin the first steps of her plan. She didn't yet know all the details, and she certainly didn't know the outcome. But for the first time in days, she felt a sense of purpose. The life she had once accepted blindly would no longer define her. And somewhere deep down, Maddie understood something crucial. The path she was about to walk would change everything, not just for Gavin, but for herself as well.
The following week brought a subtle shift in Emma's routine. Lucas seemed preoccupied, his laughter a beat slower, his eyes occasionally drifting toward his phone with attention Emma hadn't noticed before. He would brush off questions with a distracted smile or an, "It's nothing, just work," but Emma, perceptive as she had always been, felt the tiny cracks forming in their daily life. The first evening, she noticed his coat draped carelessly over a chair instead of hung neatly as he usually did. It seemed trivial, but for Emma, these small disruptions were like ripples in the surface of a once calm pond. Sophie continued to visit frequently, always with a casual excuse that seemed believable but was increasingly ill-timed. One Wednesday afternoon, she arrived unannounced, claiming she had something important to discuss. Emma welcomed her with the same warmth as always, though a faint unease lingered in the pit of her stomach. Sophie's eyes darted around the living room as though measuring the space, lingering longer than necessary on Lucas's photograph on the mantel, on the corner where Emma kept her wedding album. Emma's smile faltered for a split second, a fleeting suspicion she dismissed as imagination. Lucas returned home later that evening than usual, the city lights streaking past the car windows as he pulled into the driveway. His shirt carried the faint scent of cologne Emma didn't recognize, though she thought perhaps it was one of his colleagues' perfumes lingering from a meeting. He kissed her forehead and muttered, "Busy day," before heading to shower. Emma, trying to quell the gnawing unease, focused on preparing dinner, her hands trembling slightly as she chopped vegetables. She told herself she was overthinking, that Lucas had always been attentive and loving, and that the smallest inconsistencies didn't signify anything, yet, throughout the week, the small anomalies multiplied. Emma noticed that his phone would occasionally buzz, and he would step away, muttering an excuse, a slight edge of irritation in his voice when she asked who it was. Sophie, too, began sharing little details that seemed irrelevant at first but nagged at Emma's mind. She mentioned plans that didn't make sense, offhand comments about Lucas's schedule, subtle insinuations that something was going on, though always couched in laughter or playful tone. Emma struggled to reconcile these fragments with the trust she had in both her husband and her best friend. One rainy afternoon, Emma returned home early from work, her umbrella dripping onto the hallway floor. She had intended to surprise Lucas with a homemade treat, but the sight that met her eyes made her heart falter. Through the window, she glimpsed Lucas sitting in a corner of the local cafe, deep in conversation with someone whose hair shimmered like Sophie's under the dim light. Their heads were close together, and there was a familiarity in their gestures that Emma couldn't place. She told herself it must be a coincidence, a colleague perhaps, yet the unease settled deeper in her chest. Over the next few days, Emma found herself obsessively checking for signs, her mind a restless storm of doubt and denial. A lipstick stain on a coffee cup, a cryptic text on Lucas's phone that he quickly hid, Sophie's lingering hugs that seemed heavier than usual, all small pieces of a puzzle Emma wasn't ready to assemble. She tried to rationalize each occurrence. Lucas had meetings, Sophie was affectionate, life was messy. Yet the more she tried to ignore the signs, the more they insistent they became, surfacing in the quiet moments when she was alone with her thoughts. Emma confided cautiously in Ethan Price, a coworker and friend she trusted implicitly. Over shared lunches at a quiet cafe, she spoke in tentative tones about her doubts, careful to avoid accusations. Ethan listened with steady patience, his dark eyes reflecting concern. "Emma," he said once, his voice calm but firm, "I can't tell you what's going on, but if it doesn't feel right, trust that instinct. You deserve clarity. His words were gentle yet empowering, giving Emma a flicker of courage she hadn't realized she needed. At home, the tension became almost tangible. Lucas's absences stretched longer, his phone more guarded. Sophie's visits were punctuated by hurried departures and phone calls that left her distracted, smiling in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. Emma began to notice patterns: late evenings when Lucas supposedly had work calls, sudden errands Sophie claimed were urgent, whispered conversations she couldn't hear fully but sensed were not meant for her. Each instance gnawed at her, leaving her both fearful and unwilling to confront the possibility of betrayal. One evening, Emma sat on the couch scrolling through old photographs of herself and Sophie. Images of laughter, road trips, birthday parties, and quiet nights together blurred with the subtle unease that had grown over the past week. She realized how intertwined their lives were, how Lucas and Sophie had become central figures in her world, and how much she relied on the stability they provided. The thought that either could betray her struck with a weight that was almost physical. Her chest tightened, her fingers trembling as she set the photo album aside. She felt a deep, internal conflict, love and trust battling with doubt and fear. The first major confrontation came subtly. Emma noticed a message flash across Lucas's phone while he stepped into the kitchen. "See you tonight, Redheart." He quickly pocketed the device, his smile slightly forced. Emma's stomach dropped. She did not yet know who the message was from, nor did she have proof, but the seed of suspicion had firmly rooted itself. That night, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction, every smile, every hug, searching for patterns, trying to convince herself she was imagining things. But the unease persisted, growing into something she could no longer ignore. By the end of the week, Emma felt her world shifting. The comfort of her routine had been replaced by an anxious vigilance. She watched Lucas more closely, observed Sophie's body language, and listened to the tone of their voices with a newfound attentiveness. Small acts, Lucas's distracted glance, Sophie's lingering hand on the doorknob, an unexplained text, had begun to fracture the foundation of trust she had taken for granted. Emma did not yet have confirmation, but she could sense the invisible threads of betrayal weaving themselves quietly, invisibly, around her life. That night, alone in the quiet of her bedroom, Emma whispered to herself, "Something is happening. I just don't know what yet." Her voice was barely audible, almost a breath, but it carried the weight of the first step toward the truth. The perfect life she had once taken for granted now felt fragile, delicate, and possibly irreparable. Somewhere in the shadows of her home, hidden in small moments and subtle gestures, the reality of deception was beginning to reveal itself, inch by inch. Emma closed her eyes, heart heavy yet alert, unaware of how soon she would confront the reality she had feared, yet somehow already suspected.
Ethan Vale's presence in Maddie's life began to shift in ways neither of them could have anticipated. What started as playful companionship gradually transformed into something more significant, more potent. Maddie noticed it first. His confidence had grown, almost imperceptibly at first, but unmistakably. He spoke with a new authority at work, offered bold ideas in meetings, and carried himself with an air that demanded attention without arrogance. Maddie observed it quietly, sipping her coffee one morning as Ethan described a presentation he had led that impressed even his toughest supervisors. His eyes sparkled with pride, but he didn't boast. He simply let his work speak for him, and Maddie allowed herself a private satisfaction. The boy who had once seemed so lighthearted, so harmless, was evolving into a force she could use, not as a tool of cruelty, but as a partner in reclaiming the power Gavin had carelessly discarded. Their afternoons together became more deliberate. Maddie would suggest walks through the city, visits to art exhibitions, or networking events under the guise of casual social outings. Ethan, eager to impress and charmed by Maddie's attention, absorbed everything. He took cues from her confidence, mimicked her poise, and internalized her subtle strategies. Maddie knew she was shaping him, molding his potential like clay in her hands, but she also felt a genuine fondness for the man he was becoming. Meanwhile, Gavin continued his oblivious existence, immersed in his own small victories and distracted by Clara's attention. Maddie monitored him discreetly, noting the little cracks that had begun to appear in his carefully constructed arrogance. He complained about minor inconveniences at work, missed important social events, and seemed increasingly frustrated with the world around him. Yet he remained unaware that Maddie's quiet transformation was shifting the balance of power in their household. One evening, Maddie invited Ethan to a charity gala hosted by a prominent company in the city. It was a calculated choice, a public environment where Ethan could display his newfound confidence, where Maddie could subtly demonstrate her independence, and where Gavin might be forced to witness the change without realizing its source. Ethan arrived dressed sharply, his usual easy charm now accompanied by an unmistakable presence that drew admiring glances from the crowd. As they moved through the gala, Maddie noticed the reactions of those around her, colleagues whispering, acquaintances nodding with approval. Ethan was no longer just a companion. He was emerging as someone who commanded respect, whose presence was impossible to ignore. Maddie's pulse quickened, not with fear, but with the thrill of progress. Each glance, each subtle interaction, reinforced the shift she had orchestrated so carefully. Gavin, coincidentally attending the same event for business purposes, did not recognize the significance of what he was witnessing. He noticed Maddie and Ethan together and felt a pang of discomfort, though he could not place why. He had always assumed Maddie's world revolved around him, that she was tethered to his whims. Seeing her with Ethan, laughing lightly, completely unguarded, stirred a fleeting unease in his chest. Maddie noticed the shadow of hesitation in his expression, but chose not to acknowledge it. That was her power, silent, controlled, undeniable. Back at home that night, Maddie and Ethan reviewed the evening with casual laughter, yet beneath the surface, Maddie's mind remained focused. Gavin had unknowingly glimpsed the emerging imbalance, and Maddie knew the next steps would require even greater precision. She had to ensure that Ethan's transformation continued, that his influence grew steadily, and that Gavin remained blind to the subtle orchestration unfolding around him. Maddie began introducing Ethan to select professional contacts, carefully chosen to expand his network and elevate his status. Every introduction, every recommendation was calculated. Ethan thrived under the guidance, his confidence now solidifying into tangible results. Maddie watched with a mixture of pride and quiet satisfaction, knowing that each small victory was another step toward the eventual reckoning with Gavin. One weekend, Maddie invited Ethan to their home for dinner, ostensibly a casual gathering. She prepared the meal with meticulous care, but the intent behind the evening was strategic. Gavin happened to return unexpectedly, drawn by curiosity rather than suspicion. Maddie greeted him politely, her composure flawless, and then introduced Ethan casually, letting the subtle tension linger in the air. Gavin's initial reaction was a flicker of irritation, quickly masked by forced civility. The atmosphere was delicate. Ethan, ever perceptive, noticed the subtle cues but didn't fully understand them. Maddie allowed him to shine, an effortless demonstration of charm, intelligence, and self-assuredness. Gavin, meanwhile, felt a creeping sense of discomfort, though he refused to admit it, blaming it on fatigue or coincidence. Maddie's satisfaction was quiet but potent. She had demonstrated the emerging power dynamic without confrontation, a silent statement that would echo far louder than any argument could. As the evening wound down, Maddie and Ethan found themselves alone in the study, sipping wine and sharing light conversation. Ethan's eyes reflected a mix of admiration and curiosity, unaware of the deeper role he was beginning to play in Maddie's carefully crafted plan. Maddie allowed herself a brief, private smile, knowing that the groundwork was laid. She had nurtured his growth, amplified his potential, and positioned him to be more than just a companion. He was becoming a key piece in the strategy that would eventually unseat Gavin's arrogance. Before Ethan left, Maddie's thoughts lingered on the future. The coming weeks would require precision, patience, and calculated risks. Each interaction, each subtle influence, would further cement the transformation not just of Ethan, but of Maddie herself. The quiet empowerment she felt now was intoxicating, a reminder that betrayal need not be the end. It could be the beginning of a new, unexpected chapter. And as Maddie closed the door behind Ethan, a sense of purpose settled over her like a cloak. Gavin remained unaware of the shift, blind to the forces gathering within his own home. Maddie Harper, once wounded and uncertain, was now resolute and strategic. The pieces were moving, and the game had truly begun. The path ahead was delicate, but Maddie felt no hesitation. She had regained control, not through anger, but through precision. And somewhere deep inside, she understood that when the final reckoning came, no one would emerge unchanged. Maddie Harper awoke to the soft hum of the city outside her window, a clarity in her mind that had eluded her for months. Every step she had taken, the careful guidance of Ethan, the quiet observation of Gavin, the deliberate cultivation of influence, was coming together. The time for subtlety was ending. The reckoning she had envisioned, precise and unavoidable, was about to unfold. She spent the morning reviewing the details one last time, ensuring nothing had been overlooked. Each interaction, each exposure, had been meticulously prepared. The emails, the social hints, the strategic glimpses of Ethan's growing prominence. Maddie had become a conductor of a symphony of subtle power plays, and now the crescendo was imminent. Gavin arrived home later that afternoon, as oblivious as ever to the transformation around him. Maddie greeted him politely, her composure flawless, and invited him to dinner. There was a calm in her demeanor, a sense of control that contrasted sharply with the disheveled tension she noticed in his posture. He smiled nervously, unsure why her presence felt simultaneously familiar and foreign. The dinner table was set with understated elegance, soft candlelight, polished silverware, and carefully chosen dishes that masked the tension in the air. Ethan joined them, arriving promptly with a confident, assured presence that immediately altered the dynamic. Gavin's unease was subtle at first, a fleeting glance, a stiffened posture, but Maddie noticed every detail, savoring the quiet dissonance she had orchestrated. Throughout the meal, Maddie guided the conversation with precision, touching on topics that highlighted her independence, Ethan's accomplishments, and Gavin's own oversights without ever overtly attacking him. Ethan contributed naturally, his charm and intelligence now undeniable, subtly eclipsing Gavin in every exchange. Gavin's attempts to assert authority were clumsy, undermined by his growing awareness of how the balance had shifted. At T1 point, Maddie casually mentioned a recent company event where Ethan had presented an innovative project that had garnered widespread recognition. The way she described it, with pride and ease, left Gavin momentarily speechless. The realization of Ethan's emerging influence, paired with Maddie's composure and satisfaction, stirred a quiet panic in him. Maddie noticed, but she did not hurry the moment. Power, she reminded herself, was strongest when observed silently before it struck. After dinner, as Gavin excused himself to take a call, Maddie and Ethan shared a brief, knowing glance. No words were needed. The plan was unfolding exactly as intended. Maddie's heart swelled with a mixture of triumph and reflection. She had carefully cultivated this moment, not through vengeance alone, but through the transformation of those around her, including herself. When Gavin returned, Maddie introduced the final element, a subtle revelation of his own indiscretions, presented not as an accusation, but as undeniable fact. A misplaced email, a forwarded message from Clara, a carefully timed social media post. Each piece laid bare the truth he had tried so desperately to conceal. Gavin's initial reaction was disbelief, then defensiveness, and finally, a dawning comprehension of the depth of Maddie's strategy. You set this up?" he asked, voice tight with a mixture of shock and frustration. Maddie remained composed. "I didn't set anything up, Gavin. I just observed. And sometimes, observation is all it takes to understand the consequences of your own choices." Her voice was calm, measured, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath the words. Ethan, standing slightly behind Maddie, offered a reassuring smile. He had been unaware of the full scope of Maddie's orchestration, but his presence now amplified the impact of her words. Gavin felt the weight of their alliance, the undeniable reality that he was no longer in control of the narrative. The following hours were quiet but charged with tension. Gavin attempted explanations, justifications, even pleas, but Maddie listened without interruption. She felt a surprising sense of closure, not from cruelty, but from the empowerment of reclaiming her life and setting clear boundaries. Every excuse he offered seemed hollow, every gesture of remorse insufficient to undo the damage he had caused. By the end of the evening, Gavin retreated to his study, leaving Maddie and Ethan alone. She closed the door behind him and allowed herself a deep, deliberate breath. The storm had passed, and in its place was a calm certainty. Maddie had reclaimed not only her dignity, but the power she had lost when Gavin had chosen betrayal over commitment. Ethan turned to her, admiration clear in his eyes. "You did this, all of it," he said softly. "You didn't just take control. You transformed everything around you." Maddie smiled, feeling the weight of months of careful strategy lift from her shoulders. "We transformed it," she said, acknowledging his role while asserting her central authority. "I had to make sure no one, not even him, could underestimate me again." In the days that followed, the repercussions became evident. Gavin's professional reputation took subtle but noticeable hits. Projects delayed, colleagues questioning his decisions, and whispers about his personal life circulating where they had no place before. Maddie, meanwhile, moved through her own world with renewed confidence. She was no longer the passive observer of her life. She was the architect. Ethan continued to grow, not as a mere companion, but as a partner in every sense, ambitious, capable, and aligned with Maddie's vision. Yet even as satisfaction settled over her, Maddie knew this was more than a story of revenge. It was a story of transformation, of reclaiming identity, and of recognizing the unexpected strength within oneself. She allowed herself a quiet smile as she reflected on the journey, from betrayal to empowerment, from hurt to control, and from uncertainty to clarity. Maddie Harper, once defined by the choices of another, had now defined herself. And as she stood at the window one evening, watching the city lights shimmer like 1,000 tiny victories, she understood a fundamental truth. Power, once lost, could always be regained, not through rage, but through patience, strategy, and the courage to embrace change. The chapter with Gavin had closed, but Maddie knew that life, like any carefully orchestrated plan, would continue to unfold. And she would face it, not as the woman who had been wronged, but as the woman who had rewritten her own story, on her terms and with unwavering resolve.